Welcome to Postwave. You're here with Eric and Trevor.
So today we're going to be doing another episode centered around the topic of what reality is and how we can know anything about anything. And we're basing it heavily on this little interview with this quantum chemist, Lothar Schafer, who's a professor at the University of Arkansas. And this is on this PBS program, Closer to Truth, that has a lot of really cool interviews on topics like this. Quick disclaimer that we're just two musicians and teachers who like to talk about a bunch of subjects that are slightly beyond us. If we say anything that's factually inaccurate, please send us a nice email at postwavepodcast@gmail.com and let us know where we messed up. We always like to be learning things.
So, Trevor.
Yes.
What is ultimate reality?
Well, I would say that question doesn't necessarily have to have an answer because they're just words that we're saying using a human language, and they don't have to necessarily refer to something. Kind of like like the question, what was before the beginning of the universe? That question might all in a similar way be meaningless, because we can apply the word before to a bunch of things in our daily lives and in our normal existence, but that word doesn't necessarily map on to how things work in the bigger picture.
Interesting. So, in this interview, Lothar Schafer talks about how the ancient Greeks came up with the idea of atoms, which is just that you divide matter into smaller and smaller pieces until eventually you get to that smallest piece that you can't divide anymore. Would you say that looking for such a limit, would that be akin to looking for a definitive answer to the question, what is the ultimate reality?
No, I don't think it would be. And actually, this one thing this video kind of clarified for me is that, again, I think it's a case of us wanting to find something that's not really there, and that because we have this perception that everything's made of smaller things, and at some point there must be a smallest thing that things are made of.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's what you think, then you do get an infinite regress that just gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and there's no bottom, right? It's turtles all the way down.
Yeah, how does that happen?
How does that happen?
Yeah, I know it's a big question, but I just wondering if you could elaborate on that point a little.
Well, I
bit.
think that's kind of what he's saying. He says when you get down to actual atoms, they're a surface without a background.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is a cool idea. So let's back up a second, because we're starting to get into the things he talks about. So let's start at the beginning of the discussion, and let's go through statement by statement, and we'll talk about it that way.
Cool.
So he starts up by saying that there are 4 fundamental characteristics of what he calls ultimate reality. This is, as I would interpret it, like trying to understand what is the fundamental nature of reality or of existence. And these 4 characteristics are that it has to be non-material, non-empirical. It speaks to the wholeness of the universe, as if everything is interconnected, and that it is mind-like.
Yeah. Non-material, non-empirical. It speaks to the wholeness of the universe, and it's mind-like.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that first one is kind of what I was talking about. At some level, when you, unless you're going to have this kind of infinite regress, you have to get to some level where you're not talking about material anymore. You're talking about patterns or waves or information.
Yeah. Cool. So let's walk there. So starting out, we have this Greek idea of atomos, the smallest object. And in the modern understanding, we have I think a parallel to this idea is the Planck length.
Mm-hmm. Although I think I'm not going to remember quite what the distinction is. I think that's commonly misunderstood as the smallest length possible in the universe. It's something slightly different.
Could you elaborate on what something different
I
that
can
is?
try. I think it might just have to do with the limitations of what we're able to measure, rather than with something actually that's fundamental to the universe.
Interesting. That is contradictory to how I've heard of it talked about before.
Okay, so the first thing is that there are less units and more constants that are just kind of used to calculate things. Okay, well, I take that back. So so his goal was Planck's goal in coming up with these units was trying to find something that all civilizations could agree upon, like including alien civilization, something that was naturally discoverable as a unit, just as a natural consequence of the universe.
Mm-hmm. So my understanding of the Planck length is that at that scale, if you were to zoom really, really far in this very short distance, space-time actually breaks down, and it doesn't like the concept of space doesn't make sense on the scale underneath. And so in that sense, it's the shortest length possible.
Mm-hmm. What do you mean by the concept of space doesn't make sense?
Like what you were talking about how there's no background on which to view it in order for it to make sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds right.
And we'll elaborate on that more when we get there. So he starts out by just making the statement before we get into things that you don't really need to know the mathematics of quantum mechanics to understand these concepts. You just have to have like a general idea of how the concepts work.
Yeah, that's comforting. That's comforting to hear and nice to hear. I'm not sure I quite believe it, but I think it was Richard Feynman who is fond of saying that mathematics is the language of the universe, and to really truly understand everything at a basic level, you have to know the math. Otherwise, you're just getting kind of approximations off of approximations that are never going to quite get to the core of it.
Yeah.
And a lot of those can become contradictory.
That's interesting. That Alan Watts video I sent you, or one of the two, he was talking about how mathematics are often considered in a spiritual light. But I could throw some buzzwords at you like sacred geometry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but really what that's referring to is like that 1 + 2 = 3, and that's true even without having to say what the things are. One, what? Two, what? It doesn't matter.
Right.
And so
right.
just like seeing that framework of logic, of mathematical logic, that is just true, that's kind of fascinating and can even be viewed as spiritual.
Yeah. People can argue about whether mathematics is invented or discovered, but at some level, I think it has to be woven into the fabric of how the universe works.
Definitely. Yeah. So he starts now saying that the basis of the material world is non-material. And then he goes on to speak about how the Greeks came up with the idea of atoms to divide the world into smaller and smaller parts until you can't divide anymore. This to me is also the same understanding that I've come to through reading Michio Kaku's works about quantum mechanics, of what the word quantum means. Because quantum is just from quantization, which is to put things on a grid, right?
Right. It's like in an atom, you have the electrons that are in their orbitals, and they can't be in between. They just jump between the orbitals instantaneously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Often misconstrued as, quantum is often misconstrued as having something to do with randomness or chance or something like that, but that's not what the word means really.
Yeah, which is interesting. On a side note, regarding Michio Kaku, he explains how quantum mechanics refers to the view of the world where you look at everything as particles, as being fixed, like being material, and that when you do that, there's all these sort of funny patterns that appear and things that we can recognize and point to, but that is not the same as theoretical physics. And theoretical physics takes the more conceptual view and is based not upon empirical evidence, but on deductive reasoning.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, that's kind of the theoretical part, right? It's kind of extrapolating from what we know rather than basing everything on empirical evidence.
Yeah, observations. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and these two forms of thought are directly in opposition and complement each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a cool idea.
Yeah.
I remember Michio Kaku came to give a talk at CU Boulder, right, when we were there?
Did he really?
I feel like he did. I remember seeing posters for it.
Oh my god, I can't believe I missed that. I was reading him at the time as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, but it was like right at the beginning of our freshman year, like October 2013. So.
Yeah. So all wrapped up in just getting used to being at college.
Yeah. What a time.
Anyway.
Yeah, it's really dazzling, just the sheer number of crazy theories that are out there about what the fundamental nature of everything is. Like I think I've mentioned it before, but there's this guy Lee Smolin that has this idea that every black hole is basically creating a universe inside it, and that the universe is evolving through the creations of different universes that have slightly different parameters based on kind of random chance, and that they're evolving in this semi-genetic way and favoring universes that produce more black holes.
Yeah.
Which is just
fascinating.
I find so nuts.
I mean, it kind of makes sense, right? Like if you have a small little pocket universe that can only support so much idea, and we'll tie into this later, that it can only take so many forms, that is, that there's only so much that universe could do, but a universe that could encompass more things is more likely to stick around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it would favor something rather than nothing.
Yeah, funny how that works. So, non-material. So, the basis of the material world is non-material. So he says that in a vacuum, a single particle becomes a wave. He makes this assertion. Is this something that you've heard of before?
Uh, Maybe not necessarily in a vacuum, but there's the whole wave particle duality thing where it's kind of both.
Hmm.
Like the I think this was famously shown by the double slit experiment.
Yeah. Do you want to go into that a little bit?
Yeah. Yeah. So the double slit experiment, it's like really, really simple, so it's kind of amazing. There's a light that's being shown through these two slits in a wall, and then whatever is shining through is being projected on this other wall. And if you think of light as a particle, a certain particle could only travel through one slit at a time, right? So you'd expect these very clear patterns of just, the light showing up in two places on the wall, right?
Yeah, it's like a stencil.
Yeah. Yeah. But what you actually get is this weird interference pattern of dark bands and light bands, which implies that basically the particle is somehow traveling through both slits at the same time.
Yeah, but because right, it's like the band's pattern that it creates is the same sort of pattern that you would get by sending a wave through the two slits.
Right.
And the wave interacts with itself as it goes through the two slits, and that creates troughs and peaks.
Right.
Where it lines up or misaligns with itself to create the pattern.
Right. Yeah, just like you'll hear beating if two pitches are slightly out of tune. Same kind of thing.
And this is a concept that really makes a lot of sense to me after having explored around with music and electronic experimental live music as much as I have. And then the weirdest thing about the double slit experiment that I remember from high school when they taught us is that when they send a single photon through the slits at a time, it still shows up in the wave pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what implies that it is weirdly interfering with itself and passing through both places at the same time.
Right. Yeah, I forget about that part. That's kind of the kicker.
Yeah.
Yeah. When was that done? Do you know?
I forget.
Like the 20s or something.
Really? That early?
Let me check. Oh, wow. 1801. I'm glad I looked that up. Yeah.
How the hell did they do that?
Well, I mean, it's like I said, it's a pretty simple experiment.
Did they even have lasers back then?
That's a good question. Do you need a laser to do it?
I don't know. I've seen it done with lasers.
Mm-hmm.
There's a guy on YouTube who was able to do it with like Legos and little pen lasers.
Oh, wow.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have thought that we had the technology back then.
Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy to think of someone observing like something like that and just being so far from actually understanding what's going on, but being able to like glimpse a little bit into like this field that just has taken up just so much of 20th and 21st century physics. It's kind of beautiful. Yeah, so this non-materiality thing or non-material thing, right? This is kind of what I was talking about with you get this infinite regress. And that if you're just looking for smaller and smaller materials, you're not gonna. At a certain point, it's not gonna lead anywhere because you're getting to to pure information or pure patterns or something like that, or pure mind.
So when he says that a single particle in a vacuum becomes a wave, as I understand it, when you have different particles interacting with each other, that is making a measurement of where each of those particles are. So if a particle is in a vacuum, it doesn't make sense to say that it's a particle at all, to say that it's in a particular place, because there's nothing for it to interact with.
Huh. That's interesting. Are you saying it's indeterminate, or it's literally?
Yes, it
Yeah.
it is indeterminate. So as he says in this video, it is a wave, and that is a meaningful concept because it's a probability of existing spread out across space, and each spot in space there is a certain probability that it will exist there,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not definite.
Yeah, and technically or theoretically it's spread out over the entire universe. It's just that the probability drops off so low after a certain point that essentially it's not going to be anywhere too far away.
Probably.
Yeah. So how does that connect to the non-material thing again?
So he goes on to say that when it's a wave, it does not have units of matter or energy. It's only form, patterns of information.
Yeah, that part I don't really understand, because a wave, as I understand it, would have some kind of energy.
Yeah, I'm not sure how that. Well, maybe it's yeah. Why is the term wave used to describe a probability distribution?
We may be reaching the limits of our understanding and knowledge of quantum.
Yeah, let's put a pin in that one. And for now, we'll just take their word for it that they have good reason to say that these things are true.
Yeah, and again, if we're trying to describe these high level phenomena of waves and particles, we need something more basic like patterns or information to describe them, because we can't keep defining the thing in terms of itself.
Yeah, definitely. And then he touches back on elaborating that when he says it's just form, just patterns of information, he also frames that as being just numbers, which is the same as what we were talking about before with mathematics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think part of the beauty of that is that they're not just numbers, they're transient numbers.
Transient numbers, what does that mean?
Well, because it's constantly changing, right? It's kind of some kind of calculation that's constantly working itself out. And kind of getting back to the spiritual nature of math, I thought that was one of the really beautiful things Alan Watts was talking about, was that there's a certain spirituality to transience, and that's part of why music is one of the most sacred and beautiful forms of art, because it's so, what's the word? It starts with an E, not evasive. It's so fleeting.
Trevor, that's an F. You missed it in the alphabet.
I'm gonna think of it in like 5 minutes.
Effervescent?
That's close. God damn it! What's the word?
Elusive? Eloquacious?
Is that a word?
I don't know if that's a word. Probably not.
I think loquacious was the word. Whatever.
What were we talking about?
Alan Watts, and how music is spiritual because it's so transient. That's another word for it.
Right. Yeah, it's like it happens, and the perceiving of it in that moment of time is why it happened, and then after that moment of time has passed, it's gone.
Mm-hmm. Well, how does perceiving come into play?
well, that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and why are you creating the music if not to perceive it?
Oh yeah, I guess if we're limiting it to music, then yeah, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Although I think the metaphor may extend further than that.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the non-material part.
Yeah. So the second thing on his list for fundamental characteristics of ultimate reality is that it is non-empirical, which he says you cannot observe it, not even with an instrument.
Is he talking about just the limits of how small we can go, or is he saying something?
I'm not sure just from that statement. So let's go on one statement, and maybe that'll inform us. And Lothar Schafer starts by wrapping up what he was talking about regarding the non-material and ties that into the non-empirical. So he starts by talking about how particles in vacuum become a wave, and then that wave spreads out in space. And so the particle is actually nowhere, he says. He says it is in a state of probability to find it.
Right. And I guess why the vacuum is important is that it's not interacting with anything, right? Because if it's in the air,
yeah, that's how I interpret it.
If it's in the air or in some other medium, it's interacting with everything that it's moving around with.
Yeah, totally. So then he goes on and says, when you observe it, you collapse this state, which is what you're saying. Anytime it has that interaction, you know where that particle is now in relation to those other objects.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, and it's an interesting question. What we actually mean by look at or measure, whether it's just an interaction with something or whether I think it's commonly misconstrued as a human measuring it, but it could be a bunch of different things that aren't that.
Yeah, I wonder how could this tie in with what we were talking about before, which you had phrased as panpsychism, but we were talking about how fundamentally every particle could be considered as a point of consciousness, or that is a point of perception.
Yeah, I don't know if I think about it that way so much as and this could be right or not, or in line with how people think of panpsychism or not. But I always thought of it as more like a field. Like there's an electron field, right? And there's there's fields for kind of a bunch of different categories of particles, and the particles themselves are like wave disturbances in the field, and like concentrated points where the field is more activated. And that's kind of my suspicion about consciousness. It's not necessarily that maybe there's not really a distinction. It's not so much intrinsic to the particle itself. It's that the particle is activating something within that field somehow.
Interesting. Although, would it make sense to say that in a way that the particle is maybe inherent to the field, or is the field, rather than being some external thing that is forced upon the field?
Yeah, I think that's possible.
And that seems to be kind of in line with the concept of how a particle can also be a wave.
Mm-hmm.
Depending on how you look at it, right? And this ties into the concept of perception,
Mm-hmm.
where to look at it is maybe just to frame it in relation to other matter. So let's say you have a single particle that you're trying to figure out where it is, and you have a second particle that interacts with it. Maybe you could say that from the perspective of the second particle, the first particle can be perceived to be in a particular location, determined by their interaction. But maybe now let's take another situation where you have a whole world of particles that all function in conjunction to each other, such as our own, and there's a particle, and we're trying to figure out where it is in relation to that whole world of particles. Then that's like a a much more robust perception of the location of that particle. Does that make sense?
I think you kind of lost me at the last part there.
I think I lost myself at the last part there.
You got to go on a long journey on your own. You find yourself.
Yeah. Well, okay, so it's like you're trying to describe where that first particle is. One way you can describe it is as it relates to the other particle. Another way you could describe it is as it relates to several particles, or like a billion, trillion, gazillion particles.
Mm-hmm.
And that maybe the latter is a more stable way of representing where that particle is.
Because it's constraining things more.
Yeah, there's like a more of a framework for it to relate to.
Mm-hmm.
And so that there's more sense, more logic in saying that this is there because you have all of these other perceptions of it corroborating that.
Why, when we have a very organized and seemingly hierarchical structure like the brain, that it creates more of a sense of consciousness because it's ordered in such a complex way with so many particles and all interacting.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, in that way that are
I buy that 100%.
constraining everything very specifically.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it's fun to think about panpsychism and all this stuff. I also think that it's very possible when we get quote unquote like an answer to what consciousness is, it'll be pretty mundane. Or like it won't seem like an answer, but that's kind of the best anyone can ever do. And like kind of like I was surprised to hear Alan Watts say this, because he seems to have such a mystical attitude about consciousness and all that stuff. But he was saying that basically it's just a trick the brain does, and it's just kind of scanning the environment for changes, right? And that actually we should consider the whole brain as something that's innately and deeply connected to the rest of the universe, not just the conscious part.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, he kind of approaches it backwards from what you might expect, right? Like he starts off with it's just matter, like the brain, it's just matter, but then he says, yeah, but also you are the entire universe. So
Yeah.
So that saying the just part of that suddenly seems to make less sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like the idea that we're direct echoes from the Big Bang, and we're direct like little vortices that have formed and everything that's happened since then.
Yeah, I love that as well. So for the crowd out there, so we've just switched over. So I had sent Trevor a video of Alan Watts in response to this video that he sent me, and this video where Alan Watts talks about, he uses this metaphor of throwing a bucket of paint at a wall and connecting that to the Big Bang. So in the middle, which would be like at the center of the beginning of the Big Bang, there's just like solid paint. But if you go out towards the edges, you get to where all the paint spatters interact with the wall in more interesting ways, and you get these interesting splatters and patterns. And he connects that to us being evolved, intricate creatures on the edge of this expanding bubble of the Big Bang, so that we are those paint squiggles that are doing interesting stuff out on the edge, and that we perceive ourselves as being separate from the entire Big Bang, but really we're not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're not separate, and also I'm pretty sure most scientists would back that up. Brains are pretty much the most complicated structure we know of in the known universe. I mean, as spectacular and amazing as, galaxies and quasars and black holes and all those things are, they obey, relatively straightforward rules, and
Mm.
they're the brain, at least from our perspective and as far as our understanding goes, it's just way more complex than that.
Yeah.
If you're enjoying what you're hearing so far, we hope you'll consider supporting us by either following us on Facebook or Instagram, or subscribing to us on your favorite podcasting platform. We're out there on pretty much every one at this point. You can also give us a nice review on one of those, or tell your friends,
Give us a hug.
or send us an email at postwavepodcast@gmail.com.
So this is a question actually I wanted to ask you about this Alan Watts statement. So where do you think that perception of separation arises from?
All right, so you're asking me how I think the sense of separateness arises.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think part of it is we see other people all around us who are having some kind of internal conscious experience, and we don't have any access to their experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we don't perceive anything directly beyond what we can perceive with our five senses. So I think we have a sense that we're separate from everything we can't perceive directly.
Mm.
And I think that that's true in a sense, but if there's ever a point, which I'm sure there will be at some point, where we can beam information directly into our brains from input sources that are arbitrarily far from us, like on the surface of Mars or something, or across the globe in the Amazon, I think that sense will start to dissipate.
Well, later on in this interview with Schafer, he talks about how you cannot see mind, you cannot see ideas.
Yeah.
And so maybe that sounds in line with what you're talking about, and maybe as a more fundamental law than just happenstance.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly spot on. That was one of the things that really struck me about the theory he was positing, that the atoms they're empty in a sense, in the same way that your perception of someone else's mind is empty. That it seems like there's nothing there, or you can't perceive it.
Yeah, you couldn't conceivably look at someone's brain and see all of it and then know what they're thinking.
Right. There's just a complete disconnect between the two. Or not a complete disconnect, but from an outside perspective, there's no way to gain access to that internal world. Again, without some kind of technological transfer. And I think this is actually something that Ben Goertzel talks about, that when we have machine or brain computer interfaces, and we're actually able to connect to other people's brains, that we'll actually be able to feel what they feel and think what they think. Of course, that's going to take some crazy amount of technology, but I think it's possible.
I don't know if I buy that. I think it's possible that we can have experiences that seem to approach that experience, but I think there may be something more fundamental here about you can't fully know what those forms of the shape of that person's brain mean without being in that brain, being that person, and to be connected to it from an outside source via technology maybe lends some insight, but you'll never know the whole of it.
Yeah, and just by the very nature of you accessing it, it's going to change it
exactly
in ways that make it not what the person experiences on their own.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think it would be related, but not exactly. It could never be exactly the same.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, that actually gets to some interesting ideas about about free will that have maybe a little bit more skeptical about it, but it's possible that because there's this idea that if we could measure every neuron and have a complete picture of your brain, then we could predict everything that you would do.
Mm-hmm.
But it's possible that in measuring that, one, we might destroy the brain and kill the person.
Yeah.
But two, we would probably change it in some way that would create a cascading series of effects.
Yeah.
Which isn't to say that there's no free will necessarily, but measuring the state of the entire brain might not be possible without changing it.
That seems very intuitive
Apparently.
to me.
Yeah, even if you had like a little nano robot at every synapse that was feeding back information.
Yeah, because this isn't this just another way of saying what we talked about before? Because the experience, like you were saying, of what it is to be that person is an experience, one particular experience, and if you were to add something else to that, like you're saying, nanobots perceiving each neuron, that is an experience that is a different experience and therefore necessarily discrete, a separate experience in space-time, a separate entity.
Yeah, I mean, it's separate. It's still possible it could be identical, I think.
Well, yeah, there's that question again, right? If it's identical, then is it just the same thing?
I think it would have to be the same thing. Again, it's separate, but if consciousness is just information processing, if it doesn't matter what the hardware is,
yeah, right,
then it would be pretty much the same experience. It's possible the hardware does matter at some level.
Trevor, I can assure you the hardware does matter.
It's not the hardware, it's what you do with it. As long as it's not software,
We'll be here all week, guys.
Firmware that
It's pretty good. Could be better.
I could keep making jokes, but I'm not going to.
Oh, please go on.
Well, it's all about how it interfaces with the wetware.
The what?
People refer to the brain as wetware because it's it's tissue.
Okay, I'll take your word on that one.
I'm done. That's all the where words I know.
Yeah. Okay. Good job. You did it.
What were we talking about?
Theoretical physics.
Right.
All right. So we were talking about how ultimate reality is non-empirical, and that when a particle is in a vacuum, it becomes a wave, and the wave spreads out in space. And when it's a wave, it's actually nowhere. It is in a state of probability to find it. And when you observe it, you collapse this state. So you're perceiving that particle as being in a certain place. You're making it be in a certain place.
Mm-hmm.
But then he goes on to say that they're still real when they're a wave because they're potentialities of where they might be based on these probabilities.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is how he justifies the statement that they are real but not empirical.
Yeah, I don't know if I entirely understand it. What does he mean by empirical? Is that kind of go to the you can't measure it thing?
Exactly.
Yeah, I think this is something that Richard Feynman worked on a lot too. There's this thing called a Feynman diagram that if you want to calculate what a particle or pair of particles is doing, you kind of have to calculate every possible path and interaction, including things like emitting virtual particles that don't really exist, and then coming back together and stuff splitting, and it could be like arbitrarily complex. But if you actually do out all of that and kind of average it out, you get the right answer for what things do.
Yeah, the sum over paths theorem.
Is that what that is?
Yeah, which is the same as saying that for a particle to move from one location to another, that the way that you find what the most direct path is that you have that particle travel in every possible path, as you were describing, that eventually leads to the second place, and that the average of all of those courses is the most direct course. And not only is this a mathematical thing that you can do, but that fundamentally, according to this theory, that is what happens every time anything ever happens.
Yeah, and if you think about the just the massive amount of complexity that's creating beyond just the massive amount of complexity that we can already perceive in the universe, it's just truly beyond anything we can hold in our heads.
Yeah, like almost by definition.
Yeah.
So he goes on and talks about how uses this analogy that a molecule is like a mountain range, and it's filled with steps, and each step represents a quantum of energy. It's a quantum state, he says. A molecule stands on one of these steps, then all the other steps, infinitely many of them, are empty. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like the electron thing, right? Where if an electron's not in an orbital, the orbital, like if it's not in an excited state, say it's like a hydrogen atom where there's only one electron, then like all the upper orbitals aren't occupied. But if that electron gets excited, then it could still those other orbitals are still there for it to jump up to. I think that's kind of what he's saying, right?
I'll take your word for that. That's interesting. I haven't heard about that, but that sounds like it fits in.
Yeah, well, if an electron like absorbs a photon, it can jump up to a higher orbital.
Wow.
And then if it emits a photon, it can jump back down.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah, that's how we can see spectra of stars. Is because of the and I think that's why things glow when they have heat, because the electrons and the atoms get excited, and then when they drop back down, they emit photons as light energy.
Oh. Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah, and so he brings this in kind of as background to say that when a molecule stands on one of these states, all the other states still exist, but you can't see them. He says they're empty. There's nothing there to see, but they exist. They exist as part of the logical constitution of the system.
Yeah, again, it's kind of going back to the every possibility has the potential to happen, even if it's really small, right? There's always the possibility of these other states.
Yeah.
But he's kind of saying that there's not just the possibility that they actually exist; they're just empty, right?
Yeah, he's saying that, as far as I can understand it, it's like saying that there's like a series of boxes, and in one of the boxes you will find the electron, but once you've found it there, you know that the other boxes are still there that it could be in, but not when you have it in this one. When you have it in this one, you know that the other boxes are empty, but the boxes are still there. Which is kind of an interesting idea to me. I don't understand how he comes to that exactly.
I mean, isn't it kind of the same thing where the position of a particle isn't determined until it's measured? It's a distribution of probabilities, and it could be said to exist in all the states at once.
Yeah, but what I thought he was saying was that once you've perceived it as being in a particular state, then the other possible states exist. That's the tricky thing. Is like almost as like if you were to take it in bits of information, and you were to have a series of zeros, and one of those zeros is going to be a 1, then even when you have that 1, that the rest of them are still zeros.
And it's not like just a blank, it's a zero.
Yeah.
Like there's some presence there.
Presence, or that's the question. Presence or like concerted absence, if that has any sort of meaning.
Yeah, I mean, again, it gets to what we mean by exist and presence and absence, and I'm suspicious that this is another instance of us wanting to assign words to things that don't necessarily map onto them.
Mm-hmm.
Like we're kind of wringing our hands about what exists and what whether these empty states can, quote, be said to exist. I definitely accept that there may be a meaningful answer to that. That could be that they do exist, but I'm skeptical.
Maybe this helps us understand. He says they exist as part of the logical constitution of the system. What do you think that means?
Well, I think he's saying in order for the system to be able to exist and function at all without falling apart, that it has to have those possible components. Otherwise, it would be stuck in one state forever.
Interesting.
Right? If it didn't have the possibility, logically, it would just be stuck.
Wow. So could a framework like this then show that there is a meaningful concept of nothingness?
Well, I think it would kind of say the opposite if it's true, because even the absence isn't nothingness. It exists.
But does it?
Does the existence of absence imply nothingness? Imply somethingness?
Find out in our next episode. You win the cake.
This is slightly off topic, but do you know about how, like, Bill Clinton during the Monica Lewinsky scandal, there was this huge thing about what the meaning of the word is?
Oh no. Really?
I forget where I saw it, but I saw someone saying, like, you can tell white dudes are in real hot water when they start breaking out the philosophical bullshit.
Well, shit.
We're not in that situation.
I think we might be in trouble.
Maybe.
Oh, yeah. And so he says that atoms and molecules can make quantum jumps because they have those empty spaces they can jump into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's kind of like I was saying with the electrons. It's almost to the part where he starts talking about mind, right?
Yeah. And so he kind of ties in number 3 and 4 together. So number 3 is the wholeness of the universe. So he starts by saying, we don't really know what is going on in a non-empirical world. The only thing we have indications of is that it is something wave-like.
Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the best we can do. We can't really pin it down any more than that.
Yeah.
What was the exact phrase used again?
The only thing we have indications of is that it is something wave-like.
Oh, but before that, it was like one of the...
We don't really know what is going on in a non-empirical world. The only thing we have any indication of is that it is something wave-like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because our whole science is based on and tied up in empirical observations and that kind of thing. And to be able to justify anything, we feel like we need to have some kind of empirical basis for it.
Yeah, which makes this pretty tricky to talk about in a meaningful sense as far as our scientific community goes.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's changing. I think people are starting to embrace these concepts as being meaningful, even if they're not something that is directly observable.
Yeah, this is something Sean Carroll talks a lot about, which is that for a long time after quantum physics first were proposed and discovered, that people kind of shoved aside the actual implications of them, like whether it was many worlds
Hmm.
or the Copenhagen interpretation, where there's one kind of collapse that happens, and because they can kind of get into this whole metaphysical circular debate, and that kind of gives it the appearance of not being important or significant. But these are like real questions that if we are able to get answers to them, it would be really profound.
Yeah, there's kind of a couple moments in this interview where the interviewer kind of pokes fun at Schaefer, saying, "Oh, this is in line with like what spiritual like hippies say," and
Mm-hmm.
and then Schaefer kind of responds like, "Well, that, so what? Doesn't mean they're right. It just means that this is right."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think he called it New Agey or something.
Yeah. So he says, "It's not material. It's like a pattern. It's a form. It's information."
Yeah, and I think this theory has been around for a while, that the universe, in some sense, is just this gigantic computation that's happening. It's
Yeah.
like a very complex computation in a very pure form.
And this is already tying into the number 4 characteristic. So he goes on and says, the interviewer asks him, "Is it information for a cosmic mind?" And he responds that there's something strange about atoms. In physics, when we make a measurement, it makes sense because the instruments are connected with the known background.
Right, and this kind of gets back to the, we feel like there always needs to be a lowest level or something to refer to, and that level might just not be there in the sense that we think it should be there.
Yeah, definitely. This is an idea I've played with in the past, and in fact, the string quintet that I wrote in sophomore year of music school was inspired by this idea. It was titled "From Fireflies to Thunderstorms," and it was kind of inspired by the idea of seeing each of these phenomena, and well, they're so drastically different things. One's a bug and one's an electrical discharge, that within the context of a background of darkness, of blackness, that they have something that connects them that can be seen as being almost the same.
Yeah, yeah, because you can't define the stars without the blackness that surrounds them.
Exactly.
Yeah. Although in that case, I feel like that is kind of implying a background,
In the
isn't it?
case of the stars and the fireflies.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly, it is. And so what we're talking about here is a situation where there is no background, and so that it doesn't make sense to talk about it in the same way.
Mm-hmm.
But then he goes on and proposes something different. He says, "The background of matter is mind-like. The background of matter is mind, and everything visible comes out of it."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I just wonder how literal he's being with the word mind. And he does say mind like. And yeah, what do you think he means by mind like?
So he talks about how mind-like, he, to him, it seems to mean the structure, as we were talking about before, that it has order, that it's lawful,
Mm-hmm.
that it follows logic. That is what he defines as being mind-like.
Yeah, and at its root, it's basically just math.
Mm-hmm. Now he says that if you accept that the background of the universe is mind-like, then that also leads to a wholeness because the elements are thought-like, and so they're hanging together like the thoughts in our own minds.
Yeah, I think that's just really beautiful.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, I mean, it's tempting to go to the whole "we're just thoughts in the mind of God" or something like that, which
Uh,
could be I mean, an okay metaphorical way to think about things.
mhm.
And not God like Big Sky Daddy, but God just being the word for the entire universe.
Yeah. Well, also that's like one of the points where he was getting teased about religion, like saying that yes, this statement is not incongruous with religion, but that doesn't mean that he embraces the religion.
Yeah, I wonder if this is one of those things that in 1,000 years people will just think, wow, how could they have been that far off about all this stuff? I don't think we're too far off on the definitely at the level of chemistry and how atoms and quarks work. I think that kind of thing
Hmm.
is probably pretty solidly figured out. But all this kind of what's at the bottom or root of reality and what exists and that kind of thing. I wonder if we'll have made any progress on it, or if it'll still just be kind of a clusterfuck.
Hmm. I wonder.
If we're around in 1,000 years, which is
What do you think? Is our world fundamentally lawful?
I mean, since it has order, I think it has to be.
Interesting, but isn't isn't order an emergent property of chaos?
Um,
'Cause as I understand it, you have things happening. Let's say you're flipping a coin 1 billion times, and our human minds kind of tend to predict. There have been studies that uh, when someone's given the task, try to recreate 20 coin flips in a row, we're kind of disinclined to put a bunch of heads or a bunch of tails right in a row, to the point where our patterns become much less random than if you actually flip the coin. And when you do flip the coin, you'll find that there's quite often series of patterns that line up. You get heads, 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 and that's pretty common. And that the more coin flips you have, the higher likelihood that a longer series of that pattern emerges.
hmm Yeah, well, I think even if it's chaotic, I think chaos, like the whole chaos theory thing, is that from very well, part of it is from very simple rules. You get this unpredictable series of events, like the weather, right? It's obeying the rules are relatively simple to describe, but the complexity that they
Mm.
create kind of defies the ability to actually predict things. Because even if the universe is chaotic and there's particles moving around everywhere, there's still rules that govern how they interact when they do interact. It's not just
Mm.
like some random shit happens every time there's two particles that that interact.
Yeah, as far as we know, anyway.
Well, I think it would be obvious if it was totally random, because we wouldn't have chairs or humans or stars or planets.
Right. Yeah, there's definitely some element of predictability there. But is there also, couldn't you say that there's an element of not predictability as well? Like there's some things that you don't know what will happen.
Yeah, but that's just like the well, one, it's the limitations of our ability to just the limitations of our intelligence, and there also might be some uh you know non-deterministic effects of quantum mechanics, but that's not the same thing as being completely random. I don't think, because even the randomness obeys a probability distribution. Again, it's not like everything has an equal probability. It's that certain things have a greater probability
Hmm.
than others.
But maybe I'm playing the devil's advocate, or maybe I'm not.
It's totally
Who
random.
knows? Yeah. No. Um, as I understand it, since every object in the universe can be represented as a complex waveform, like the aggregate of the waves that make it up, that there is a real, although astronomically small, possibility that weird, random, unexpected things could happen, like all the atoms that make up your body could simultaneously disappear and reappear in a random location in space. Like, there is a probability that that will happen, even if it happens to be very remote. And maybe the remoteness of that probability is only an artifact of being in a world that through chance, through having an infinite number of coin flips, eventually created an emergent stable pattern that makes it so those things are really unlikely to happen.
Huh. So how do you think it got that way again? I think you kind of touched on it at the end there, but like, how do we end up in this world where there are recurrent patterns like that?
Well, because in this universe, it seems that we do have infinite coin flips, or in the multiverse or whatever. That is to say, infinite occurrences of things just happening. And if you have that for long enough, you start to get patterns that just happen to allied with each other and make the appearance of being a stable system. But in fact, that's just an illusion that has happened due to existing for so many iterations.
Yeah, and it could be, I don't know if this is exactly the right term for it, but existence bias. Like, have you heard of a Boltzmann brain?
Tell me.
So that's this idea that kind of like we were talking about with experiencing every possibility in the wave function.
Mm-hmm.
Just we're perceiving this one as continuous because it has continuity, or like everything proceeds from moment to moment with obeying what seem to be simple rules, and it all kind of connects. But the Boltzmann brain is the idea that we could just be this extremely unlikely fraction of a second occurrence of all these particles coming together in the universe to form this experience very briefly, and then like splitting apart again.
Yeah.
and we would have no way of knowing.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And this is, again, the same thing we were talking about in our second episode that we published, the time episode, because at that time we were talking about time as being the illusion where a sequence of events just sort of happen in order. And we were wondering about that, like, how is there, like, let's say that we have that Boltzmann brain and just random things are happening moment to moment to moment to moment with no continuity. But then why do we have the perception of continuity from one instant to another? Why do we have this appearance that things exist over the course of time?
Right.
And maybe that's just because it happens to appear that way.
Yeah, and we can only experience an infinitesimal moment at a time. We can't have a bigger perspective on what's actually happening. We're limited to the actual perceptual present.
Yeah. It's one of those things that you can't think about too hard, or else you might lose yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he posits that there's a lawful world, and I kind of disagree on him for the reasons that we've just talked about. Or you could maybe see it in a dualistic sense. You could see that this world has elements of chaos and elements of lawfulness.
Mm-hmm. Again, I don't think chaos and lawfulness are exclusive, or chaos. they're not opposed.
Certainly.
I think the chaos just implies that you can't predict it. Even if you have the laws.
Interesting.
And I think that it does kind of rely heavily on our human limitations to predict things. But yeah, I don't know for sure. That's a good question.
Yeah, well, because maybe the the lawfulness is an emergent property of the chaos and therefore only an illusion, or maybe not. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, we humans do like to see patterns and things, so
Mm-hmm.
maybe we're just all these rules are just like patterns that aren't really there on the grandest scale.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe they're not there on the grandest scale, but they appear to be here now, and so we can find meaning in that.
Yeah, yeah, we're getting the Shakespeare and the all the monkeys typing on the typewriters.
Yeah. So he is tying together the interconnectedness and the mind-like elements of ultimate reality by, he says, if it is thoughts that hang together, so there is wholeness, then it is also not viable because you can't see my thoughts. You can't see the thoughts of the universe and so on. This is like what we were talking about earlier in the episode. And I thought there was this funny little exchange at the end where the interviewer says, so are you saying that the fundamental level of reality is thoughts? And Schafer says, you could say that. And the interviewer says, I'm not the one who's saying that. Are you saying that? And he's like, yeah, I'm willing to say it. At the fundamental basis of things, they are not things. They are patterns. They are thoughts. They are forms. Thoughts are in a cosmic mind, he says.
Yeah, that goes back to the mind of God kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, with the very loose definition of God. But I also think he's kind of playing fast and loose with the word thought and what that actually means.
How so?
Well, because thoughts are these things, these experiences that we have because of our human brains. And it might be, again, it's I don't think he's saying it's exactly like that. He's saying it's similar,
Right.
because whatever it is way more abstract.
Right. Yeah. The ideological landscape, as I like to put it, the conceptual as opposed to the physical.
Yeah. So these thoughts brought to you by the universe.
Somehow that's oddly comforting. Maybe that's why people like religion.
Yeah. I mean, it connects to the free will thing for me, which I do find comforting in a way.
Interesting. You guys will have to check out our free will episode on that. We're not getting into that again here. Whoa, man.
Bruh.
This is some mind-bending shit.
Dude. Some mind shit.
Shit mind. I don't know.